So we'll go ahead and get started. We have four panelists. This is Cultivating the World in the 18th Century, and I've read some of the papers and they're great, so I'm very much looking forward to this panel. So we're going to start today with Elizabeth Hyde, who's Associate Professor and Chair in the Department of History at Kean University and co-coordinator of the Department of History Honors Program. She received her PhD in History from Harvard University. Her first book, Cultivated Power, Flowers, Culture, and Politics in the Reign of Louis XIV, published in 2005, explores the collection, cultivation, and political importance of flowers in early modern France, and was the recipient of the 2007 Elizabeth Blair McDougall Award. She has also edited and contributed to A Cultural History of Gardens in the Renaissance, 1400 to 1650, published in 2013. And she is currently writing of monarchical climates and Republican soil, nature, nation, and botanical diplomacy in the French-American Atlantic world, a book that explores the cultural and political dimensions of 18th century transatlantic botanical exchange through the work of French botanist André Michaux. She continues to work on a cultural history of early modern how-to books. And her paper today is called Naturalizing the World in 18th Century France, 18th Century Bayonne, a garden proposal by André Michaux.
Thank you, everyone, for coming so early this morning at the very beginning of our conference, and thank you to the organizers of the Western for what I know is going to be a great couple of days. In 1787, the botanically curious Dr. Manasseh Cutler, en route from Boston to New York and Philadelphia, detoured to visit the much-touted French garden recently established in New Jersey near present-day Hoboken. Cutler wrote in his diary with disappointment, "There were a considerable collection of exotic shrubs and plants set in a kind of beds for transplanting. The American plants they had received were mostly sent to France. There was no order nor beauty in the gardens, the soil remarkably sandy and poor, the situation wretched, and the way to it as bad as can be well conceived. Of all the places in America, this would have been the very last, I should have thought, for such a purpose. What could induce Michaux to fix down in this awful, gloomy, lonely, miserable spot is beyond my power to conceive. I was never more disappointed and regretted the pains that I had taken to see the ill taste and judgment of this botanical Frenchman." The botanical Frenchman to which Cutler referred was the French botanist André Michaux, who, fresh from an official botanical mission to Persia, was dispatched in late 1785 to the United States to study and collect North American specimens. His mission was the culmination of an aggressive attempt on the part of French botanists at the Jardin du Roi and ministers in the French government to acquire knowledge and specimens about North American plants, and especially trees, that might find a happy culture in France. The botanical history of Michaux's mission is well known. The most enterprising aspect of French efforts at colonial botany, Michaux systematically explored the North American mid-Atlantic and South, establishing nurseries in Hoboken, New Jersey, and Charleston, South Carolina, where American plants could be gathered before shipment back to France. With the help of his gardener and his son, François-André Michaux, he sent tens of thousands of seeds, trees, and even birds back to France, along with his observations on their cultivation and uses. These could thus furnish not only the highly desired aesthetic for the 18th century landscape garden, but also the intellectual capital of growing botanical knowledge and the much needed timber, they hoped, for shipbuilding, each of which better positioned France in the global 18th century. The garden visited by Cutler was the plot of land near present-day Hoboken, shown on this map by Michaux. Selected by Michaux from where, as he explained to his superiors in Paris, he could gather specimens from New England and the mid-Atlantic, and be near the pack boats departing regularly from New York to France, on which he would dispatch his specimens. Word of the French garden's establishment in New Jersey caused a bit of a stir. Local newspapers reported the actions of the New Jersey State Assembly, and subsequent accounts of the garden heightened expectations. The Political Intelligencer and New Jersey Advertiser reported in April 1786 that Mr. Michaux, botanist to His Most Christian Majesty, having purchased a lot of ground at Weehawken near the Three Pigeons, is erecting a garden there which, for magnificence and such, will far surpass anything of the kind in America. A year later, the New Jersey Journal and Political Intelligencer announced the site of the garden and reported that part of this space is at present enclosing with a stone wall see the plan of the garden, and a universal collection of exotic as well as domestic plants, trees, and flowers are already begun to be introduced to this elegant spot, which in time will rival, if not exceed, the most celebrated gardens of Europe. The situation is naturally wild and romantic between two considerable views. In view of the main ocean, the city of New York, the heights of Staten Island, and a vast extent of distant mechanisms on the western side of the landscape. Such romanticized accounts perhaps contributed to the disappointment of Manasseh Cutler. To Michaux, however, this marshy, sandy, and otherwise largely barren land was well situated to accomplish exactly what he intended, the gathering of specimens for the restoration of French forests. Michaux's practical deployment of the Meadowlands area of New Jersey, shown here, of course, in the 21st century, is often regarded as one of the least attractive, unproductive, and smelliest wastelands in the United States. It perhaps piqued Michaux's interest in the role of plants in contributing to the valuation of land and place. For upon his return in 1795 from his 10-year exploration of North America, André Michaux proposed to Louis-Guillaume Le Monnier, professor of botany at the Jardin du Roi, the creation of a garden for one of the, by reputation, if not suggesting this is true, but by reputation, one of the least attractive and unproductive wastelands in France, the region north of Bayonne, or the lands of Gascony. Over the course of his time in North America, so there's the map showing Bayonne, and this is the region specifically that he's targeting. On his return from his 10 years in the United States, Michaux was exposed to a wide range of plants that he believed could help the French government. Many of the plants that he sent back were sent directly to the Jardin du Roi. Others went to Rambouillet, to the royal collections, where the specimens were intended to be studied as part of the unmatched French Royal Botanical Collection. But after his return to France, he suggested a means by which the mission could bear larger fruit. Michaux drafted a prospectus, which I have to credit Julie Landweber with actually finding in the archives when she was looking for other matters and came upon Michaux, and she said, "You've got to see this," and I'm so glad that she did. He drafted a prospectus for the environmental repair of this region of France. In the memorandum, Michaux proposed the creation of a botanical garden. Two copies of this. One, he says the provinces in this region, essentially, and another one he specifically says Bayonne. Always savvy about geographic and climatic strategy, Bayonne, he wrote, was well situated close to the sea, but also to the mountains, and therefore not only unified the climate and the terrain of both areas, but had the advantage and situation of being able to grow specimens that would naturalize in both regions. In other words, Bayonne offered a variety of terrain and climate conditions that would allow for the cultivation of a broad variety of plants. Specifically, the project was intended to recover or improve the region north of Bayonne. Located between Bordeaux and the French slopes of the Pyrenees, Bayonne was geographically, strategically located, of course, on the southwestern coast of France. I don't need to be telling you all this, from where it acquired peoples and goods from Spain and Portugal. The arrival of significant numbers of Spanish and especially Portuguese Jews in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, in the wake of the arrival of the Inquisition in the Iberian Peninsula, is believed to have led to the development of one of the most important artisanal traditions in the region. Portuguese Jews are believed to have brought with them knowledge of the production of chocolate, recently brought, of course, from Central and South America, for which Bayonne is still known today. At the same time, Bayonne could take advantage of American and English traders doing business just to the north in Bordeaux, which of course had been merged as an increasingly important port in the Atlantic world. If geography had been kind to the merchants in the region, it had been less so to its farmers. The soil around Bayonne was sandy and marshy and not very productive. Farmers traditionally tended sheep, but growing other crops was difficult, and attempts at improving the productivity of the region were undercut by the source of the problem, large shifting sand dunes that hampered attempts to improve the soil and impeding attempts to cultivate it. Indeed, the residents of these moors, or land as they were referred to, had taken to using stilts to maneuver the marshy terrain. The land, or moors, then posed a specific environmental challenge that demanded action by Enlightenment agriculturalists and botanists. As early as 1787, attempts were made to address the challenge by planting specific grasses to fix the dunes in place. But Michaux proposed something much more ambitious. Freshly returned, of course, from North America and armed with botanical knowledge and specimens gleaned from a broad range of contacts and sources, Michaux imagined a botanical garden for trees and foreign plants that would contribute to the resuscitation of what he termed sterile lands along the Bay of Biscay, long thought to be unproductive. The lands of Bordeaux, he wrote, which extend in the space of more than 100 leagues, are not as sterile as one might imagine, hence his proposal. Rather, through the selection of species from all over the world, the land could be environmentally, agriculturally, and economically transformed. The object of this enterprise, he wrote, is to render the usefulness of science and botany and naturalize a great number of plants which have been discovered in the last century. Their utility would be realized in multiple arenas. There's a copy of the prospectus and then the detail. He wrote, in the large number of them can be found medicinal plants that would be useful in the arts and, in manufactures. He enclosed the prospectus with a list that you see here of some of the plants susceptible to being naturalized in this kingdom. And on this list he included soursop, the tallow tree of China, the soybean, rose apple, the Bermuda cedar, sweet gum, American ginseng, the textile nettle that creates rami. It was a broad list. Collectively, the plants offer significant medicinal, agricultural, economic, and industrial potential. If the jam rose or the rose apple and soursop failed to become staples in the French diet, ginseng, of course, became highly valued for its medicinal properties and had already become, of course, an important item of trade between North America, Asia, and Europe. The textile nettle, Urtica nivea, of course, is the source for rami, which is still used today. And of course, the soybean has become one of the most important and versatile plants in the global ecosystem, responsible for feeding billions of farm animals and people in the 21st century. So it's an impressive list. Michaux proposed an environmental intervention that, if successful, held the potential to economically and agriculturally transform the region. Now, in his travels around North America, Michaux systematically noted what plants and other natural resources were being exploited, how, where, and for what purposes by the American settlers engaging in developing the American continent. Environmentally astute, he also noted when he believed Americans were misusing the seemingly plentiful arboreal resources of which the French were in such dire need. Specifically, he criticized the American waste, as he saw it, of oak trees in creating zigzag fences and so forth. Michaux was correct in anticipating the success, however, of many of the plants that he proposed to introduce into Bayonne in being successfully naturalized. Ironically, many of them are now considered invasive species in many different parts of the world. But at the historical moment of his prospectus, he was primarily thinking, writing, and botanizing from a position of environmental and ecological optimism. He was also thinking at an interesting moment in the history of the colonial machine. Michaux was a significant cog in that French colonial machine, and he saw himself as a faithful servant of the French nation. Indeed, when presented, and I have a slide out of order. When presented with the opportunity to explore the North American West on behalf of the American Philosophical Society, the subscription list of which you see here, he would agree to it only with the understanding that he worked first for the French. He wrote to Jefferson, "Bound by all manner of considerations to my country, I owe to her my services, and the primary objective of my researches on natural history is to fulfill my obligations in this regard. The second objective is to be useful to America." He indicated in his communication with Jefferson that he saw scientific knowledge, however, to be gleaned from this expedition as universal. And in drafting his prospectus for Bayonne in the late 18th century, he could do so with the hindsight of successful crop introductions, individual cases of crop introductions about which we were going to hear more through the work of Julie and Oliver and April. The project for Bayonne, however, was broader than the introduction of plants from French metropole to French colonial periphery or French colonial periphery to periphery. For Michaux proposed the introduction of plants from a range of colonial perspectives. So back in order. The Plants that Michaux listed came from North America, from South America, from China, from India. They're, as I said, the botanical fruit of the age of exploration. And the stories and or histories, and I use both words on purpose here, of their introduction to Europeans are confused and contested, and evidence, I think, of their importance as national botanical traditions seek to stake a claim to their becoming known in the Western worlds. The soursop, for example, here was native to Central America and the West Indies. It is thought to have been introduced to Europe via Hans Sloane, and yet it's not clear if Michaux acquires knowledge of it from the Americas or from its presence in European botanical gardens. The story of the tallow tree of China suggests that it was brought by Pierre Poivre from China through his gardens and then into France in the mid-18th century, while Benjamin Franklin, and Franklin is in many of these stories, and I think many of them are likely apocryphal, while Franklin is credited by some with introducing it to North America, perhaps via his French contacts. The introduction of the soybean to North America, also sometimes credited to Franklin, is more likely to have come from Samuel Bowen, a sailor with the East India Company who returned from China only to emigrate to Georgia, where he shared seeds with a fellow Georgian in 1765, and they began to cultivate the crop in the American South. It's thought to have been introduced into France in 1779, where it is recorded as being grown in the Jardin du Roi, but there's no broader knowledge of its use beyond that. The jam rose, or the rose apple, was native to the East Indies, and then cultivated in India and Salon, and then introduced to Jamaica, and from there spread to Bermuda, the Bahamas, West Indies, Mexico, and Peru. The textile nettle, native to China, but had made its way into European botanical gardens before being exploited commercially. Michaux's letters, frustratingly, do not reveal specifically where and how he learned about each of these different plants. He was, of course, in regular correspondence with his colleagues and superiors at the Jardin des Plantes, where many of these plants were known, but he was also in contact and conversation with the like-minded plant collectors and botanists in the Americas. His American mission took him around the new United States. He was in touch with the Bartrams there and connected with British botanists. His explorations took him to South Carolina, where he made contact with the French and other merchants from around the world, to Georgia and to Florida, where he was in contact with the Spanish governor. He also went to the Bahamas, where, of course, he would have encountered the plants that had been introduced into the Caribbean ecosystem. It was a project the boundaries of which extended beyond the French colonial machine. Indeed, he envisioned the intersection in Bayonne of something bigger. It was the intersection, again, of these multiple colonial networks. The situation in Bayonne, he said, is to the greatest advantage from Bayonne, you could procure a correspondence, an easy correspondence, between Bordeaux and the seeds and plants of North America, with England from the countries of their recent discovery, which I've represented here as India on the map, as well as with Spain and Portugal for those of Peru, Mexico, and Brazil. Michaux's plan, however, would not be realized. In 1801, when the Napoleonic government finally reinstituted national regulations governing forest management, work on the restoration of the land began with earnest. And instead of adopting a global and varied selection of plantations to resuscitate the soil, as suggested by Michaux, officials resorted to a planned plantation of trees, the introduction of maritime pines from the Mediterranean intended to fix the soil. The result was a man-made forest that transformed the local environment and economy through the growth of trade in rosin and turpentine and through the alteration of the climate around Bordeaux. It's credited with moderating the effects of the Atlantic and making the region more favorable to the production of wine. Michaux was not to know of it. In 1800, he set sail to the South Seas on an expedition of Nicolas Baudin. He disembarked, however, at the Ile-de-France in 1801, where he stayed, and then moved on to Madagascar, where he died in 1802 in the process of establishing a botanical garden. His son would continue to promote the potential for naturalizing American trees in France, but Bayonne would have to wait until the 1990s for a botanical garden. Michaux's prospectus, however, serves as testament to the universal sentiments of this botanical Frenchman's belief that the global botanical riches of the world could transform an awful, gloomy, miserable spot in France. Thank you.